conflict is important, but conflict does not necessarily lead to an inclusive society. And what we emphasize in the book is that it's some sorts of conflict which are important in triggering this transition from extractive to inclusive institutions. And we have a concept which we call the broad coalition. So let me try to motivate that in the following way. In 1688, they had this thing called the Glorious Revolution. I don't know why they call it the Glorious Revolution. It's like English people, want to think they're important or something. So, but the Americans are just as bad. They think we think we're important, they think they're exceptional. So, what happened in the Glorious Revolution? Let me tell you a little bit about the Glorious Revolution, a few more details. Now, there was a king called James II. The Glorious Revolution deposed James II. He went off into exile into France, where he kind of, was upset and depressed. So James II, there were many grievances against James II, and one of the main grievances was he was interfering in legal cases. The judiciary was not independent. He was interfering all the time with judges, trying to appoint judges he liked. Some judge, sounds familiar? Some judge would give a ruling James II didn't like. He would kick them out and try to put one of his friends in. So this was a lot of grievances. Okay? Now imagine, we're in a coffee shop in London, in the city of London, and I'm trying to start a revolution against James II. We're all here because we're upset. James II, he's interfering in legal cases. He's getting these rulings he likes, and it's not fair. And I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, Tudor, let's get some guns, we'll get organised, we'll get onto the street, we'll get rid of James II, and then when we're in power, we'll get the legal decisions we like. He's getting the legal decisions he likes now, but once we're in, we'll get the legal decisions we like. We call that the iron law of oligarchy. Okay? This is how conflict, and this is very true historically, conflict often basically just involves one powerful elite being replaced by another powerful elite. Okay? This was a terminology coined by the great German sociologist Robert Michels early in the 20th century. Pareto, also the Italian sociologist, talked about this too. They called it elite circulation. So this would be an example of elite circulation. James II would be out, Tudor and I would be in, and we'd be appointing the judges we liked. Okay? So if you look in detail at the Glorious Revolution, you see that actually there were programs like that on the table. Okay? So this is very common in world history, and it's very common in Latin American history. But then, what happened during the Glorious Revolution? Well, think about it like this, So I'm trying to encourage you, let's get out there. Having a revolution's risky, but, there's a lot to gain here. We could be getting all these favourable legal decisions. But now there's more people, and I'm sort of saying, okay, Don, I'll give you the legal decisions you like too, no problem. And Alexandra, you get the legal decisions you like too. And Nadia, you get the legal... But then, the more people get involved in this... I mean, after all, what happens if you two are in a dispute? I can't simultaneously give you both the legal decisions you like. So what you see in the opposition to James II is a very kind of broad cross-section of society gets involved. Merchants, farmers, elites, from across the political spectrum, ordinary people, what we call a broad coalition, very diverse, very heterogeneous. And what you see emerging as a sort of strategy for mobilizing people in this contest is not a kind of he'll be out and we'll be in, but more like, okay, we can't give everybody favorable treatment, so let's give everyone equal treatment. Let's have a level playing field and nobody gets favorable treatment. And this is when, in some sense, equality before the law emerges in England at this time. And it comes from a particular political coalition pressing for change. So how would you apply any of this to thinking about the Romanian case? Well, I think, first of all, thinking about the Romanian case, you have to recognize that Romania has an immense history of extractive institutions. Romania, at least in current dollars, has an income per capita which is about the same as Colombia or Peru. But this is not a rich country, but it's not a very poor country either. Sierra Leone or Democratic Republic of the Congo has an income per capita of about $300 or $400 per year. So Romania is in this. Why is Romania poor, let's say, compared to the United States? Because it has suffered for hundreds of years under extractive institutions. When the Glorious Revolution was taking place, when the French Revolution was taking place, when enormous institutional transitions were occurring in 19th century Western Europe, Romania was controlled by the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was an immensely extractive organization, and it was, in both senses, it had very extractive political institutions. It had very narrowly concentrated political power, and it had a very weak state. There was no effective bureaucratic administration created by the Ottomans in the Romanian lands that were capable of providing public goods and enforcing laws and regulation. There was tax farming, and that was about it, to my understanding. So all of this institutional dynamics that took root in Western Europe, that transmitted itself to North America and other parts of the world, were completely blocked in the Balkans, in Romania, in Bulgaria. It's a similar thing, okay? And that legacy, kind of reproduced itself, you could say, in the Soviet period. Again, I would say, how to think about the Soviet era or the Ceausescu regime. This was an immensely extractive set of political institutions which created a very extractive economy. So the big picture about why GDP per capita in Romania is $6,500 or $7,000 and not $40,000, that is the big picture. Okay, the big picture is that it's nothing to do with the Romanians or the geography or the climate or having had bad economic advisors. It's to do with this history of extractive institutions and how that has sapped the opportunities and the incentives of the Romanian people. But what I sense here, as I said, it's very similar to Latin America, is that the state is very far from being effective in the way I tried to suggest. And even though there's democracy, political power, there's all sorts of problems in the way political power is exercised and distributed in society. And if I had to use one word which comes from my Latin American experience, it would be clientelistic. Okay? So one of the big transitions that I described talking about the emergence of the rule of law in England in this contest against James II was that the legal system ceased to be used in a clientelistic way. James II had given legal disputes, given legal judgments to people whose support he needed, whose money he wanted, who he wanted on his side. It was only with the Act of Settlement in 1707, after this, that the judiciary became completely separate, completely independent from the politicians in England. So clientelism, the way that state in England was organised before 1688 was very clientelistic. The way that regulations were applied, the way that taxes were levied, the way that rules were used. This was all based on personal relationships, on kind of exchange between politicians, between powerful people like James II and people in society. So it was a society not of rules, but of deals. So my sense is that, in every country in Latin America that I know, that's still a huge problem. So I would say you could think about this as a problem of the state. The state basically doesn't operate according to rules. It often operates according to political criteria. Contracts are not given to the best person. The job is not given to the best person. The best person is not promoted. The person who's hired or promoted is the person with the right connections. The contract goes to the person, goes to the part of the country where political support is needed at the next election. So this is how things work in Colombia, and I sense there's a fair amount of that going on in Romania. And I would say from my own perspective, even though you have elections, having a very clientelistic political system is not a way of having a really, what I would call a broad distribution of political power. So Don talked about corruption and, problems of corruption, the many prosecutions of corruption in Romania by the DNA in the last year. But I guess from my perspective, I'd sort of say, where is all this corruption coming from? And where are these many other issues that people seem to be worrying about in Romania, such as the independence of the judiciary or, the impunity of politicians? Where is that coming from? I think it's coming from this very clientelistic way in which politics and the state works. And I think one of the things you notice in Latin America in a clientelistic society is that clientelism severs accountability. If I come to you at an election and I buy your vote, or I give you a contract, or I give your cousin a job, or I do you a favour, I pay your son's school fees, then that's That's the deal, you know. I gave you this, you voted for me, you supported me, end of story. There's no accountability in that relationship. So what you see in the Latin American examples, I don't know here, but is an enormous failure of accountability. Nobody looks at politicians and says, oh gosh, they didn't do what they promised to do, so let's kick them out of office and put somebody else in. So there's a failure of accountability, and I think, you know, this issue of impunity, for example, that's enormously reflective of a kind of extremely cavalier attitude by political class towards issues of accountability. We're not accountability, you know, we're not accountable, we do what we like. But, you know, I think to try to talk about Colombia even and to talk about Romania, you need a richer framework, you know, you need to have this sort of middle ground, you know, where you have this combination of extractive and inclusive. So I think that Romania made a huge progress, but in many ways it seems to be, you know, there's this potential to get stuck. And let me give you one example before I talk a little bit about how one might think of changing this. You know, think about Greece, you know. What was the problem in Greece? Greece had a very similar history in some sense up until the early 19th century of Romania and Bulgaria. It was in the Ottoman Empire. It had many of the same legacies. It had authoritarian, it didn't have socialism in the 20th century, but it had dictatorship, authoritarianism. What happened in Greece? Greece joined the EU in the 1970s, but no plan really emerged to change this problem. Greece inherited the same intensely clientelistic state and political society, under provision of public goods, many elements of extractive political institutions, creating many elements of extractive economic institutions. And Greece was stuck with that, and it's still stuck with it. And to me, one of the most depressing things about the current Greek crisis is the Greek crisis is all about paying off the debt and cutting wages and raising taxes on the Greeks. It's not about solving the fundamental problem. So the Romanians have to avoid getting stuck in the same place the Greeks got stuck in the 1970s, which is let's join the EU, we all get very euphoric, there's lots of improvement, we got rid of the dictatorship, we have democracy, that's great, but it's a very low quality democracy and it's a very low quality state. And I think you've seen over the last 40 years the extent to which that's limited the transition in Greece. It's blocked Greece from becoming a very different, successful society. You can't rely on the benevolence of political incumbents to change the system to make it less extractive. Why is that? Well, they're all playing the game. You know, they're responding, politicians respond to incentives too, and they're in structures which create enormous advantages to behaving in this clientelistic way. In some sense, that's a trap. It's a trap for all the politicians. You know, that's how politics works. If you try to do something else, you lose. It's very hard to compete in a clientelistic society. And for one thing, it's not just about the supply of clientelism by politicians. It's also about the demand, you know. It's about what citizens demand. If you expect the society to be clientelistic, you don't expect public goods. You expect favours, you expect money, you expect a contract, you expect a job. And if you don't get it, then you think, God, I've got nothing now. So it's about, you have to think about it not just from the supply side, but also the demand side. One of the things I've noticed working in Africa also is that one of the things which makes it so difficult to get out of this is that everybody's expectations are coordinated around this. Not just politicians, but also citizens. So somehow you have to break out of that. And I think if you were thinking about the supply side and the demand side, it's more difficult to do that from the supply side. And here's another source of persistence maybe. You know, the first generation of politicians who ran this country after the collapse of Ceausescu were themselves, you know, brought up and educated in the socialist system. So they played the same game, and they took the game and they reproduced it in a new democratic society. So that's another big element, it seems to me, of persistence in many parts of Eastern Europe. So supply side of clientelism, the demand side. So let me relate that back to what I talked about before when I was talking about James II, which is the broad coalition. You know, in some sense, what changed dramatically the dynamics of institutions historically in England was this broad mobilization in society. Okay? And that actually relates to a famous idea in political science about what generates a transition from a clientelistic to a non-clientelistic type of politics. And this is a This is an idea from a great political scientist in the 1970s called Michael Schefter. And what Michael Schefter did was he sort of noticed that if you look at democracies which have extractive features, and he didn't use that terminology because we hadn't made it up then. So he didn't say that, but he should have done. So if you look at democracies which have these extractive features, very clientelistic, what is it that leads to a transition from clientelism to something else, to a politics which is about public goods, about rules, And he showed that in many historical cases, that happens when civil society organizes, when new political parties organize with the help of civil society outside of the existing political system. That was true in 19th century England also. England still had, lots of clientelistic elements in the 19th century. If any of you have been to Oxford or studied in Oxford, in the 19th century, in the second half of the 19th century, Oxford, the parliamentary constituency of Oxford was actually suspended for 5 years because there was so much, treating going on at elections. Treating means like free beer, basically. Free beer and food to vote in a particular way. So what Schefter showed is that what seems to trigger this transition is the mobilization of civil society who are kind of outside of this game, this clientelistic game, and the emergence of what I would call a broad coalition. So in the book, we talk about the example of Brazil. So Don mentioned this, that one of the big success stories in Latin America in the past 20 years is Brazil. There's been very rapid economic growth, enormous expansion of education, falling poverty, falling inequality, which is remarkable in Latin American history. What drove that? What drove that is this coalition of people that emerged starting in the late 1970s, early 1980s against the military, intellectuals, middle-class people, civil society, institutionalized to some extent through the Workers' Party. But the Workers' Party, which sounds like, what Ceausescu had, I guess, is actually a very heterogeneous animal. It's full of very different people from across the social and political spectrum. So a very broad coalition of people formed to contest the power of the military in Brazil in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And I think that resonates with Schefter's idea about what creates a transition away from clientelism in a democracy. It's about civil society. It's about civil society organizing. It's about a collapse in the demand, what I call the demand side for clientelism. It's about people recognizing their rights to get public goods, the right that politicians are accountable, that civil society mobilization, to us, what we call empowerment through a process of empowerment, I don't have enough time to talk about that, seems to be enormously important in precipitating change and trying to shake a society out of this clientelistic equilibrium. We're not in Uzbekistan or Angola, and Romania is a place to me which has just had huge success in the last 25 years. But I think my concern is getting stuck, with the iron law of 18%. Actually, you're more or less around 18%, So let's not have a Romanian iron law of 18%. Let's, try to think about how to make this transition, to take it one more step out of extractive democracy state into something much more inclusive. And I guess one of the reasons why I was, so happy to accept Don's invitation to come here was, as I've been trying to emphasize, and I've tried to show at various times, I think what we found, Daron and I, when we've been studying this over the past 20 years, is just how critical, this is something de Tocqueville understood very well, how critical civil society is in kind of breaking out of this trap and pushing institutions in a much more inclusive direction. Okay, thank you.